Big Shaq was just passing by when he heard the sound of a guitar. Then, a loud crack. He turned to see a cop standing over an old man, his only possession shattered at his feet. The crowd gasped. Phones were recording. The cop smirked. Streets no place for beggars. Shaq didn't argue. He just stepped forward, towering over the officer, and smiled. Because he had a plan. What happened next shocked the entire city, destroyed the officer's career, and proved that justice always wins. Stay till the end. This story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Ladies and gentlemen, the old man said with a warm smile, strumming his guitar, this one's for all the dreamers out there. His voice carried through the cold evening air, rich and full of history. Eddie Willis, an elderly black veteran, sat on a battered milk crate, his fingers effortlessly gliding over the strings of his worn-out guitar. The instrument had seen better days, its wood chipped, its color faded, but the sound, pure magic. Pedestrians rushing home from work slowed their pace. A businessman in a stiff suit stopped mid-stride, his brows lifting at the unexpected beauty in Eddie's voice. A young woman, lost in her phone, pocketed it, mesmerized. A child no older than 10 tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama, listen!" The crowd grew, forming a half circle around Eddie. Coins clinked into his open guitar case. A few people pulled out bills, their eyes soft with admiration. And then among them stood Shaquille O'Neal. The basketball legend, in town for a charity event, had been on his way to a nearby shelter when the music caught his ear. Dressed casually in a hoodie and jeans, he folded his massive arms and smiled, nodding to the rhythm. Eddie's song had stopped Shaq in his tracks. As Eddie's voice soared into the final note, the small crowd erupted in applause, except for one man. A figure loomed at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, face twisted in disgust. Officer Bradley Kane. His uniform was crisp, his belt heavy with authority, but his eyes, cold and judgmental, scanned Eddie like he was nothing more than a stain on the city. The applause faded as Kane shoved his way forward, shouldering past an elderly woman. The energy shifted instantly. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. "All right, show's over, folks," Kane barked. Eddie's fingers stilled on the strings. His smile wavered, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not hurting anyone, officer," Kane sneered. "You're loitering, panhandling, disturbing the peace." A teenage girl frowned. "Disturbing the... He's just playing music." Kane ignored her. His fingers flexed around his baton. "I said, pack it up." Eddie met his gaze, steady but calm. "This guitar, it's all I got." Kane's lip curled. His jaw tightened. And then, crack! Gas rang out as Kane slammed his baton down, splitting the guitar in half. Strings snapped, the wooden body crumbled, and Eddie, his lifeline destroyed, could only stare. The street went silent. Then, a deep rumbling voice behind Kane made him freeze. Now that was a mistake. The deep rumbling voice sliced through the stunned silence, carrying the weight of something undeniable, authority that didn't need a badge to be recognized. Officer Bradley Kane stiffened. His jaw clenched as he slowly turned, already sensing that something was different. He was used to people averting their eyes, stepping back, surrendering to his presence. But this time, as he turned, he had to look up, and up, and up. Shaquille O'Neal stood before him, arms folded, his towering frame casting a shadow over the stunned officer. Kane's cocky smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he quickly regained his composure, rolling his shoulders back as if to remind himself that he was the one in uniform. The authority here was supposed to be his. Shaq, however, showed no sign of intimidation. His expression was calm, his dark eyes locked onto Kane with quiet intensity. There was no need for raised voices or threats. His presence alone was enough to tilt the balance of power. "What's the charge?" Shaq asked, his voice smooth but firm. "Playing music too well?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few chuckled under their breath. Someone in the back muttered, "Yeah, what's the charge, officer?" A young boy clutched his mother's hand, his wide eyes darting between Kane and the fallen guitar. Kane could feel the shift happening. Moments ago, he was in complete control. The crowd had been silent, afraid. Now their energy had changed. The fear was melting away, replaced with something else. Defiance. Eddie Willis sat frozen on the pavement, his trembling fingers hovering over the shattered remains of his guitar. The old man looked utterly lost, as if the last piece of his identity had just been ripped away in front of his eyes. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Kane tightened, his grip around his baton, willing himself to regain control. This was his job, his city, his rules. His voice sharpened, laced with a desperate attempt to assert dominance. "Step back, big guy. This isn't your business." Shaq didn't move. His arms stayed folded, his stance unwavering. "You broke his guitar in front of everyone," Shaq said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Now you expect us to just walk away like it didn't happen?" The officer's fingers twitched near his belt. His usual tactics, fear, intimidation, brute force, felt useless against the man standing before him. Shaq finally leaned in just enough to make Kane feel the weight of the moment. "It is now." The entire street stood still, watching, waiting for what would happen next. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The crowd, once hesitant and afraid, now stood their ground, watching with wide eyes as Shaquille O'Neal towered over Officer Bradley Kane. The shift in power was undeniable, but Kane wasn't ready to let go of control just yet. His fingers twitched over his baton, the same one he had just used to destroy an innocent man's only possession. His jaw tightened as he forced a smirk, trying to mask the uncertainty creeping in. He had been challenged before, but never like this. Never by someone who wasn't afraid of him. Kane's hand gripped the baton, his knuckles turning white. He took a step closer, puffing out his chest. "I said, step back." His voice was sharp, edged with an authority that no longer carried the weight it once did. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his deep voice steady, unshaken. "You broke his guitar, now what? You gonna arrest me for breathing?" A few people in the crowd muttered in agreement. Someone snorted. A woman near the front shook her head, her arms crossed in defiance. Kane's radio crackled. "Unit 47 report." The voice on the other end was expectant, waiting for confirmation. It was protocol, a check-in he was supposed to respond to. But Kane didn't reach for his radio. He didn't move for it at all. Instead, his eyes stayed locked on Shaq, his pride unwilling to back down in front of the very people he had spent years keeping under his boot. Then a small voice cut through the thick silence. "You can't do that! He's innocent!" Kane's head snapped toward the sound. A young boy, no older than 10, stood beside his mother, fists clenched at his sides. His face was flushed, eyes shining with righteous anger. He had seen everything, and so had everyone else. Shaq's gaze flickered to the boy for a split second before returning to Kane. His patience was running thin. This wasn't about ego. It was about right and wrong. Kane saw the shift in Shaq's expression, the subtle change from calm to something colder, heavier. He didn't like it, so he did what men like him always did when they felt their power slipping. He smirked. "All right then, big shot," Kane said, voice dripping with false confidence. "Let's see how you like spending a night in jail." The crowd gasped as Kane reached for his cuffs, ready to make a move he would never be able to take back. The metallic clink of Kane's cuffs echoed in the tense silence as he reached for Shaq's wrist, his smirk unwavering. But before the officer could snap them shut, a sharp screech of tires sliced through the air, making the entire street turn. A second police cruiser skidded to a halt at the curb, its lights flashing red and blue against the surrounding buildings. The driver's side door flung open, and out stepped Sergeant Lisa Monroe. The air shifted in an instant. Monroe wasn't just another cop. She was Kane's superior. A high-ranking officer with a no-nonsense reputation, she commanded authority the second her boots hit the pavement. But tonight, her authority came with a storm brewing behind her eyes. She had heard everything. Her jaw was tight, her fists clenched at her sides as she took in the scene. The shattered guitar, the horrified faces in the crowd, Shaq standing firm, and most importantly, Kane, caught red-handed. "What the hell are you doing?" Monroe's voice cut through the thick tension, her tone sharp enough to make Kane visibly flinch. Kane hesitated. This was the moment he had been dreading, when someone with actual power stepped in. His gaze darted around, looking for an escape, an excuse, anything. Kane cleared his throat, forcing himself to straighten. "I was keeping order, Sarge." His voice carried none of the arrogance from before. Instead, it was laced with something else. Panic. Monroe's expression darkened. "Keeping order?" she echoed, stepping closer, her boots crunching against the pavement. Her eyes dropped to the broken guitar, then back to Kane. "By smashing a homeless man's guitar?" The weight of her words settled over the crowd. Kane's face paled. His authority was slipping through his fingers like sand. A teenage girl near the front held up her phone. The screen was still recording. "We got it. All on video," she said matter-of-factly. Kane's breath hitched. He had lost control. Sarge, I can explain," he stammered, his confidence crumbling. Monroe's arms folded tightly across her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line, her glare unforgiving. "Oh, you're gonna have to," she said coldly. Kane swallowed hard as Monroe took another step forward, ready to make him answer for everything. The silence was suffocating. The weight of the moment pressed down on Officer Kane like a slow-moving avalanche, crushing everything he had built his career on. Then cutting through the heavy tension, a teenage girl's voice rang out, sharp, clear, and undeniable. "Too late. We all saw it." All eyes turned toward her. She stood near the front of the crowd, her phone held high, screen still glowing. She gave a small, satisfied smirk before tilting the device slightly for everyone to see. "I got everything on video," she announced, "and I just posted it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathering. More people pulled out their phones, notifications lighting up their screens. Within seconds, the footage had already started to spread like wildfire. Kane felt his stomach drop. His pulse hammered against his temple as he stared at the phone in the girl's hand. He had spent years getting away with things like this. A shove here, a threat there. Intimidation always worked. But now, the power was no longer in his hands. It was in hers. And the whole world was watching. Shaq took a slow step forward, his massive presence making Kane feel even smaller than he already did. A smirk played at the edges of Shaq's lips as he folded his arms across his chest. "Hope you like being famous, Kane." The officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. Sergeant Monroe's phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it. She didn't need to check to know exactly what was happening. The anger in her chest simmered as she turned toward the teenage girl, her voice even but heavy with meaning. "How many views so far?" The girl glanced at her phone, her eyebrows lifting slightly. 30,000. The crowd gasped. Some exchanged glances, whispering in disbelief. The video had only been online for a minute. Kane swallowed hard. His badge suddenly felt like a target pinned to his chest. Monroe exhaled sharply, her patience officially gone. Without another word, she pulled out her own phone, tapped the screen a few times and turned it toward Kane. The color drained from his face. His own department had already seen it. The police station's official page was flooded with comments. Reporters were already tagging the city's officials. This wasn't just a bad night, this was the end. Monroe's voice was like ice. "Hand me your badge, now!" Kane's fingers trembled as he reached for his badge, knowing there was no way out. Kane's fingers hovered over his badge, his mind racing a mile a minute. His career, his authority, everything he had built through fear and intimidation was slipping through his grasp. One badge, one gun, one decision. If he gave them up, he was nothing. His breathing grew shallow. The weight of dozens of eyes pressed down on him. He had never felt this kind of pressure before, not in a way that he couldn't control. Monroe's expression remained cold, expectant. "Now, Kane!" His hand twitched. Then in a flash, he moved. Instead of his badge, Kane lunged for his radio. He clutched the device with a death grip, his thumb jamming down on the button. Desperation dripped from his voice as he barked into the receiver. "All units! Officer under attack! I need backup! Now!" The world seemed to stop for a split second. Then, chaos. Gasps shot through the crowd like wildfire. People stumbled back. Someone screamed. A mother instinctively pulled her child behind her. The weight of his words sank in immediately. Kane was lying. He wasn't under attack. No one had touched him. But those words, those carefully chosen, weaponized words, could turn the situation deadly in an instant. Shaq took a slow step forward, towering over the officer, his eyes locked on him with a disbelief that quickly turned to something darker. "You're really going to pull that card?" Shaq's voice was low, steady, but laced with unmistakable disappointment. "You know what happens when cops say those words?" Kane didn't respond. His eyes darted around wildly, as if searching for an escape. A few of the bystanders still had their phones out, recording every second. The video was still streaming. And now? Kane wasn't just a man who broke a guitar. He was a man willing to risk innocent lives to save himself. Monroe's jaw clenched as she reached for her own radio. "Disregard that call," she snapped into the speaker. "No officer is under attack. Repeat, disregard. But the damage was already done. The distant wail of sirens pierced the air. Multiple units were on the way, rushing toward a threat that didn't exist. Kane's chest heaved. His pupils were blown wide, like a cornered animal. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Oh, now you really messed up. The sirens grew louder, the blue and red lights flashing against the city walls. Backup had arrived, but not for Kane. Across town, inside a dimly lit office stacked with case files and paperwork, a phone rang. Chief Donovan Hayes barely glanced at it. His attention was on the reports in front of him, paperwork detailing excessive force complaints against officers, corruption allegations, things the city wanted buried. His department was already under fire, and the last thing he needed was another mess. The phone kept ringing. With a frustrated sigh, he grabbed it. Hayes! Chief! A strained voice said on the other end. We got a problem, a big one. Hayes frowned, sitting up. What kind of problem? There was a pause, then, check your email. Hayes narrowed his eyes but reached for his laptop. His fingers moved quickly, opening the inbox. The subject line read, Officer Bradley Kane, viral incident. With a growing sense of unease, he clicked. A video loaded. The first frame was a homeless man on the ground, his guitar split in two. Then Kane appeared, cold, smirking, drunk on power. And then the baton came down. Crack. The impact wasn't just on the guitar, it was on everything. The clip played on, showing the crowd's horrified reactions, Shaquille O'Neal stepping in, Monroe arriving, and then, the moment Kane grabbed his radio. All units, officer under attack, I need backup. Hayes's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what those words meant. A false call, a dangerous lie. His hand gripped the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. His officers had already responded, sirens screaming through the streets. If they arrived believing one of their own was under attack, innocent people could die. His jaw tightened, his heart pounded. He grabbed his radio, his voice sharp as a blade. Put him on the radio, now! Back at the scene, Monroe's radio crackled. She lifted it, eyes locked on Kane. A slow, cold smile spread across her face. She turned to him, holding the radio out. You want to tell the chief why you're on camera abusing a homeless man? Kane's face went pale as the radio buzzed in Monroe's grip. The chief was waiting, and there was no escape. Kane's hands trembled as the radio crackled to life, the weight of his career teetering on the edge of destruction. Then the voice came through, cold, sharp, final. Officer Kane, you're fired. A stunned hush fell over the street. Even the sirens in the distance seemed to fade, drowned out by the gravity of those words. The crowd who had spent the last several minutes witnessing Kane's abuse of power unfold in real time barely breathed. Kane's throat went dry. His pulse pounded against his temples. Fired? Just like that? His mind reeled, searching for a way out, a loophole, anything. He had connections. He had years on the force. This wasn't how things worked. Bad cops got protected. They got slaps on the wrist, not termination over a single incident. The radio hissed again. Badge! Gun! Now! Kane turned to Monroe, his eyes darting wildly. You can't just do this. Chief, listen. This is all being blown out of proportion. Monroe stared at him, unimpressed. Blown out of proportion? She gestured to the crowd. You want to explain that to the dozens of witnesses? She nodded toward the teenage girl still holding up her phone. Or maybe to the thousands of people watching live. Kane's gaze snapped to the screen and his stomach twisted. Over 200,000 views. In minutes. The damage wasn't just done, it was irreversible. This is insane, Kane muttered, his breath coming in short gasps. He looked at Monroe, then at Shaq, then back at the chief's radio, as if someone, anyone was going to save him. No one did. Monroe stepped closer, voice low and firm. You heard him. Hand it over. Kane's fingers shook as he reached for his badge, the weight of it suddenly suffocating. Slowly, he unpinned it from his uniform and held it in his palm, staring down at it like it was a lifeline he wasn't ready to let go of. For the first time in years, he wasn't a cop. He hesitated. Monroe's patience snapped. Gun! Now! Kane swallowed hard and unclipped his holster, pulling the weapon free. He stared at it for a moment, his mind racing, his fingers tightening around the grip. For a second, just a second, something dark flickered across his face. Monroe's stance shifted immediately, her hand dropping to her own weapon. "Don't even think about it, Brad." Kane blinked, his grip loosening just enough for Monroe to snatch the gun from his hand. He jolted in shock, but it was too late. The last shred of his authority was gone. Monroe exhaled sharply. "Get in the car, Brad." Kane hesitated again. Then a voice from the crowd, loud and clear. "Guess he's not so tough anymore." Laughter followed, then claps, then cheers. Kane's face burned with humiliation as officers grabbed his arms and led him toward the squad car. As the door slammed shut behind him, Kane's gaze darted to the cameras still recording. His downfall wasn't just public, it was permanent. The roar of the crowd still echoed through the street as the squad car carrying Kane disappeared around the corner. The weight of justice had finally fallen, and for the first time that night, the tension in the air began to fade. But not for Eddie Willis. He sat frozen on the pavement, his fingers still resting on the shattered remains of his beloved guitar. The instrument that had carried his voice, his memories, his soul, gone in a single heartless act. Shaq turned to him, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the broken wood and snapped strings. His voice, deep yet warm, cut through the fading commotion. "Now," he said, arms crossed, "about that guitar." Eddie blinked up at him, confusion flickering across his weary face. "What? What about it?" Shaq didn't answer. Instead, he turned on his heel and started walking. The crowd parted as he moved, curiosity rippling through them like a wave. Eddie, still in shock, hesitated before shakily pushing himself up to follow. The murmurs of the spectators trailed behind them, whispers of, "What's he doing? Where's he going?" Then Eddie saw it. A small music shop sat just a few storefronts away, its neon sign buzzing softly in the dimming light. Shaq strode toward it with purpose, pushing the door open and stepping inside without hesitation. Eddie's breath caught. The store was filled with beautiful instruments, each one more pristine than the last. The warm scent of polished wood and fresh strings filled the air. Shaq didn't browse. He didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the most expensive guitar in the shop, a sleek, high-end beauty, its surface smooth as glass, its strings humming softly as he lifted it from the display. The shop owner, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. Shaq placed the guitar on the counter, pulled out his wallet, and dropped a thick stack of $100 bills in front of the owner. "For Eddie," he said simply. The owner barely hesitated before nodding. "Good choice." Shaq turned, holding the guitar out to Eddie. For a long moment, the old musician just stared at it, his hands trembling. His lips parted, but no words came. His eyes, tired, weathered, filled with tears. I don't know what to say," Eddie finally whispered. His voice broke. Shaq grinned, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "How about another song?" Eddie wiped his eyes, his fingers grazing the strings. And for the first time that night, the music was about to begin again. Bradley Kane slumped in the back of the squad car, his mind reeling. His fingers curled into fists, his jaw locked so tight it ached. The flashing lights from the street outside blurred together as the reality of his downfall settled like a weight on his chest. He had lost everything, but still, somewhere in the back of his mind, a small ember of hope burned. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out of this. Cops like him didn't just go down like this. He had seen worse officers slip through the cracks. A few calls, a little legal maneuvering, and he could be back in uniform within months. Or so he thought. The officer driving the squad car spoke into his radio, his voice tight. "Unit 47, transporting Bradley Kane to central booking." Then, as if on cue, the car's onboard laptop pinged. A notification flashed across the screen. "Internal Affairs Report, urgent update." Kane frowned, shifting slightly in his seat. The officer glanced at the screen, muttered something under his breath, then turned the volume up on the radio. Static crackled before a voice came through. Sharp, commanding, and impossible to ignore. "Mayor Reynolds has ordered an immediate investigation into police misconduct, effective immediately." Kane's stomach dropped. He barely had time to process before the voice continued. "New evidence has surfaced linking Officer Bradley Kane to multiple excessive force complaints and civil rights violations." His mouth went dry. The officer in the front seat turned to look at him through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. Kane could feel his pulse hammering against his ribs. "What the hell is this?" he snapped. I don't have any open cases." The officer turned the screen toward him. The sight made Kane's blood turn to ice. There they were, his sins laid bare, a growing list of complaints, videos of past incidents where he had shoved, threatened, and brutalized civilians. Reports that had once been buried deep under the weight of police bureaucracy were now front-page news. And the worst part? The city wasn't covering for him anymore. The officer pulled the car over. "Bradley Kane," he said flatly, unlocking the back door. "Step out." Kane's body went numb. He barely felt the cold night air as he was pulled out of the car, his former colleagues waiting for him. Only this time, they were standing beside him. They were waiting to process him. Kane finally understood. This wasn't just a suspension, not just a bad week. His entire career was over. The city had been holding its breath. The chaos, the injustice, the anger. It had all built up like a storm waiting to break. And now as the dust settled and Bradley Kane was finally out of sight, the energy shifted. It was Eddie's moment. The old man stood in the center of the sidewalk, his fingers gently wrapped around the neck of his brand new guitar. The polished wood gleamed under the streetlights, the strings untouched, waiting to be played. He swallowed hard, emotion thick in his throat. He had spent years playing music for strangers, singing songs for people too busy to listen. But tonight, they were all listening. A hush fell over the crowd as Eddie took a breath, adjusting his grip on the guitar. Then, he strummed. The first note rang out, crisp and golden, humming through the night air. The sound was different now, fuller, richer, untamed. It was the sound of a man who had lost everything and gained it back. The melody swelled, warm and familiar, wrapping around the city like a long-lost memory. Eddie's voice followed, deep and soulful, carrying the weight of every hardship, every battle, every moment that had led him here. And the people? They felt it. Some closed their eyes, swaying gently. Others recorded on their phones, not out of spectacle, but because they wanted to remember this. A young man near the front wiped his eyes, caught off guard by the rawness of it all. Shaq stood with his arms crossed, watching. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he took in the sight. A street that had once been filled with tension, now alive with music. Eddie played like he was telling a story. He played for the ones who had been ignored. He played for the ones who had been silenced. And most of all, he played for himself. As the last note lingered in the air, the crowd erupted in applause. Loud, thunderous applause. Eddie chuckled, wiping at his damp eyes. He looked over at Shaq, shaking his head in disbelief. "Didn't think I'd ever play again," he admitted, voice rough with emotion. Shaq gave him a knowing smile. "Looks like the streets had other plans." He turned to the crowd, nodding in approval. Then, with a satisfied grin, he clapped Eddie on the shoulder and said, "Now that's how you end a show." The music wasn't just a performance. It was a statement. And the city? It was listening. Respect isn't given. It's earned. Eddie's voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it. The kind that only comes from a life lived through struggle and resilience. He looked out at the crowd still gathered, faces illuminated by streetlights and phone screens, people who had just witnessed justice in real time. The night had started with a broken guitar and a display of unchecked power. Now it was ending with something stronger, something unbreakable. Shaq stood beside Eddie, arms crossed, watching as the old musician carefully ran his fingers along the polished wood of his new guitar. It was more than just an instrument. It was proof that when people stand together, the right thing happens. A young woman in the front of the crowd lifted her phone. "It's everywhere," she said in disbelief, eyes wide as she scrolled through the screen. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "How many views?" "Almost 1 million," she replied. The crowd gasped. People murmured in amazement, others grinning as they refreshed their screens. The video of Kane smashing the guitar, Shaq stepping in, Monroe stripping him of his badge. It was all spreading like wildfire. Eddie let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Guess I'm famous now," Shaq smirked. "You were always famous. They just weren't listening before." Eddie's eyes softened. He nodded, then did what he did best. He played. And this time, it wasn't just a song, it was a statement. The melody filled the air, floating above the city like a promise. People swayed, hummed along, some even wiped at their eyes. This wasn't just a comeback, this was a victory. Meanwhile, across town, in a dark office filled with ringing phones and tense voices, the mayor watched the video. His expression was unreadable. his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The footage had done more than just take down Kane. It had exposed a deeper rot within the system. Now there were questions, investigations, demands for accountability. And this time, there was no sweeping it under the rug. Back on the street, as Eddie's final note hung in the air, Shaq clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You did more than play tonight, old man," he said. "You reminded people what real power looks like." Eddie smiled, the kind that came from knowing he had finally been heard. The viral video? It changes everything.